The vast prairie holds many paths. Some lead to fortune, others to ruin. But the truest path is the one guided by courage and a compassionate heart. The smoke rose against the horizon, a dark omen staining the vast, empty sky, and Evelyn Harper felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She guided the wagon, its wheels groaning under the weight of soap, dried peaches, and the fragile hopes for a new life in Santa Fe. Beside her, her young daughter Louise hummed a tune, oblivious to the tension that clung to the air like dust. The rhythmic clang of hammers echoed from the railroad being built nearby, a relentless sound that seemed to divide the land that had never truly belonged to the men who claimed it. For weeks, the land agent Barlow had been pressuring the settlers, his smile thin and his offers insultingly low. He wanted their plots for the railroad, and his threats were veiled but clear. Evelyn clutched the deed to her small piece of land, the only inheritance she could give Louise. It felt like a shield against the encroaching greed of men like Barlow. That night, the sky glowed with an unnatural orange light. Her neighbors' wagons were ablaze, the flames casting long, dancing shadows across the sand. Panic flared, but thankfully, no one was harmed. It was a warning, a brutal message sent in the dead of night. But the true horror came with the dawn. Louise was gone. The small blanket where she slept was empty, the air suddenly cold and silent. A wave of nausea washed over Evelyn as she stumbled out of the wagon, calling her daughter's name until her voice was raw and broken. Her desperate cries were swallowed by the immense silence of the prairie. On the sand, strange tracks led away from the camp, heading towards the jagged maw of a nearby canyon. Without a second thought, Evelyn ran, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She followed the tracks until her lungs burned, her mind a storm of fear. It was there, among the towering rock formations, that she heard a long, low whistle, a sound that seemed to weave itself into the wind. A figure emerged from the shadows. He was a Diné man, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression watchful but not menacing. He introduced himself as Kai Toshani. His eyes, dark and perceptive, met hers with an unnerving calm. "I saw two riders," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through her panic. They were leading a child toward the dry wash. The world seemed to tilt beneath Evelyn's feet, a dizzying mix of terror and a sliver of hope. This stranger, this warrior, was her only chance. "I know the trails," Kai continued, seeing the desperate plea in her eyes. "They follow paths that outsiders cannot see." Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. She would follow him anywhere. She would trust him. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the faint sound of hoofbeats reached them from far ahead. Her fear began to transform, hardening into a cold, sharp resolve. She would get her daughter back, no matter the cost. Kai knelt, his fingers hovering just above the tracks in the dust. "They are not moving fast," he observed quietly, his gaze sweeping the path ahead. "They believe no one will follow." He pointed out the slight drag of a small boot, a detail Evelyn would have missed in her frantic state. They moved with a newfound purpose, their silence broken only by the crunch of their feet on the rocky ground. But soon another sound disturbed the peace, the rumble of wagon wheels and the harsh shouts of men. Evelyn's blood ran cold. It was Krieg, Barlow's right-hand man, his cruelty a known fact among the settlers. He was flanked by two others, their faces grim and set on violence. They were not just after Louise anymore. They wanted the land deed. "Get behind the boulders," Kai commanded in a low voice, his body already moving. Evelyn scrambled for cover, pulling herself into a small crevice between two large rocks. She watched as Kai pulled a short bow from his back, his movements fluid and economical. He knocked an arrow and drew the string back, his focus absolute. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. The first arrow hissed through the air and embedded itself in the sand just inches from the led horse's hooves. The animal reared, screaming in surprise. A second arrow followed, landing in the same spot with pinpoint accuracy. The message was clear. Krieg and his men cursed, but they pulled their horses around and retreated, disappearing back the way they came. Evelyn emerged from her hiding place, her body trembling. She looked at Kai, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. This stranger had risked his life for her, for a child he had never met. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He simply nodded, his eyes already scanning the trail again. They pressed on, their pace quickening. After another mile, they came across an old telegraph line. The wires had been recently cut, the metal glinting in the sunlight. Kai's expression hardened. "Krieg," he said. The name a curse on his lips. "He uses the old postmaster's station as a hideout. They have taken her there." A new wave of fear washed over Evelyn, but it was now laced with determination. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the landscape, they found it. A dilapidated barn stood near a cluster of cottonwood trees, looking forgotten and forlorn. A single narrow window was cut into its side. From within, they could hear the faint, heartbreaking sound of Louise's crying. Evelyn's maternal instinct screamed at her to rush forward, to tear the door from its hinges, but Kai placed a firm hand on her arm, stopping her. "It could be a trap," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the barn. He pointed towards the stables connected to the main structure. "There is another way." They would wait for the cover of darkness, for the moment when they could turn the hunters into the hunted. The flicker of torchlight danced against the weathered walls of the barn. Krieg and his men were returning, their voices loud and coarse as they scoured the area. Inside the stuffy darkness of the stables, Kai gently lifted Louise into his arms, her small body trembling. Evelyn clutched a bundle of papers Kai had swiftly grabbed from a crude table inside the station, documents belonging to Barlow. They slipped out a back opening and descended a narrow path carved between clay bluffs where the torchlight could not penetrate the deep shadows. They were nearly clear when one of the men spotted movement. A shot rang out, the sound echoing through the canyon, a sharp crack that made Evelyn flinch. The bullet ricocheted off the rock face harmlessly above them. Kai pushed Evelyn and Louise down into a shallow ravine, shielding them with his own body. He paused for a moment, his senses on high alert. Then, with a quick, decisive movement, he picked up a loose rock and hurled it far down the path, away from their position. The stone clattered against the canyon wall, creating a convincing sound of someone fleeing in the wrong direction. They heard Krieg shout an order, and the sounds of their pursuers faded as they followed the false trail. Safe for the moment, they found refuge in a small grove of wild plum trees. The sweet scent of the blossoms a strange contrast to the acrid smell of fear that clung to them. Evelyn held Louise close, listening to the frantic beating of her own heart. Louise's sobs were muffled against Evelyn's shoulder. Kai knelt beside them and gently placed 2 fingers on the child's lips, murmuring a few soft words in his native tongue. The sound was melodic and calming, and to Evelyn's astonishment, Louise's crying subsided into quiet hiccups. The girl's wide, frightened eyes stared up at the man who had saved her. They waited in the darkness, the calls of distant coyotes their only company, until the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky. The pursuit had ended for now. Kai suggested they head back towards the main settlement, but Evelyn knew it was not over. Barlow would not stop. He would send more men. He would never let them be. The land deed was not enough. "We have to fight back," Evelyn said, her voice surprisingly steady. She looked at the papers in her hand. Barlow's records. A potential weapon. "We cannot run forever. He has done this to other families. We have to expose him." Kai looked at her, a flicker of respect in his dark eyes. He saw not a frightened woman, but a survivor, a protector. He nodded slowly. "To do that," he said, "we must return to the place of greatest danger." They would have to go to Santa Fe, into the very heart of Barlow's power. It was a daunting, perilous idea, but fear was giving way to something new inside Evelyn. It was a burgeoning strength, a fierce determination to protect not just her daughter, but the future of every family in the valley. The journey to Santa Fe was fraught with tension. They avoided the main trails, moving through arroyos and across rocky mesas under the cover of dusk and dawn. During the heat of the day, they rested in the shade of ancient junipers. Louise, exhausted but safe, rarely left her mother's side, though she often cast curious glances at Kai. He would sometimes carve small figures from scraps of wood for her, a bird with outstretched wings, a running horse. He taught her how to find water by watching the flight of bees, and how to identify the edible roots of a yucca plant. Evelyn watched their quiet interactions, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the desert sun. She was beginning to see the man behind the stoic warrior. One evening, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire, Evelyn tended to a shallow cut on Kai's arm, a wound he had sustained during their escape. She cleaned it with a cloth dipped in whiskey from her flask. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly, her fingers brushing against his skin. "Why help us?" Kai was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Barlow's railroad is not just taking land from your people," he finally said, his voice low. "It carves up the earth. It scares away the game. It poisons the water. My people have lived in these canyons for generations. This land is our mother. I fight for her, just as you fight for your child." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of profound truth. Evelyn finished wrapping the wound. Her hands lingered on his arm for a moment longer than necessary. "My husband died 2 years ago," she found herself saying, the words coming out in a rush. "He believed in this land. He said it was a place where we could be free, where we could build something that would last." She looked up at Kai, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I was starting to lose that belief. I was starting to believe that men like Barlow always win." Kai's expression softened. "They only win when good people do nothing," he replied. In that moment, a bond formed between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended their different worlds. It was a fragile trust, born of shared danger and a common purpose. They needed a plan, one that did not involve walking into the sheriff's office with accusations that could be easily dismissed. The papers they had were incriminating, but likely not enough to sway a town living in fear of Barlow's influence. "We need more than just his records," Evelyn reasoned, thinking aloud. "We need someone on the inside to confirm they are real, someone who has seen his dealings firsthand." Kai mentioned the town's scribe, a timid man named Arthur who kept all the official records. "Barlow has leverage over him," Kai warned, "but every man has a breaking point. Perhaps a little push is all he needs." Their new goal was clear: find Arthur and convince him to stand for the truth, no matter the personal cost. They entered Santa Fe under the cover of a moonless night, sticking to the narrow alleyways that smelled of wood smoke and dust. The town was larger and louder than Evelyn remembered, the sounds of a saloon piano clashing with the barking of stray dogs. Kai moved with a silent grace that made him seem like a shadow, while Evelyn kept Louise's hand held tightly in her own. They found shelter in an abandoned livery stable at the edge of town, the scent of old hay, a comforting blanket against the chill. From a grimy window they could see the main square, bustling with activity even at this late hour. Barlow's office, a 2-story brick building, loomed over the smaller shops, a symbol of his dominance. Fear was a palpable thing in this town. The next morning, Evelyn left Louise in Kai's care and went to the market, her shawl pulled low over her face. She needed to gauge the town's mood and find the scribe's office. The whispers she overheard confirmed their fears. Settlers spoke in hushed tones of unfair contracts and sudden evictions. Everyone knew what Barlow was doing, but no one dared to speak out. The sheriff, a portly man with a perpetually bored expression, walked his rounds, pointedly ignoring the worried faces of the townspeople. Evelyn found the scribe's office tucked between a blacksmith and a bakery. The sign on the door read, "Arthur Hemlock, Public Notary and Records." She took a deep breath and reminded herself of what was at stake. Arthur Hemlock was a small man with spectacles perched on his nose and ink stains on his fingers. He looked up nervously when Evelyn entered, his eyes darting around as if expecting trouble. She explained her situation carefully, leaving out Kai's involvement for now. She spoke of the altered deeds and the threats, her voice low but firm. Hemlock listened, his face growing paler with each word. He wrung his hands, avoiding her gaze. "I cannot help you," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Barlow is a benefactor of this town. To go against him would be unwise." He was terrified. Evelyn could see that his fear was a cage, and Barlow held the key. Persuasion would not be enough. Disheartened, Evelyn returned to the stable. "He is too afraid," she told Kai. "Barlow has him trapped." Kai listened patiently, his expression unreadable. "Fear can also be a weapon," he said after a moment of silence. "We do not need to threaten him. We need to show him that his fear of Barlow is nothing compared to what will happen if the entire valley turns against him." The plan began to form. They would not confront Hemlock directly again. Instead, they would use the documents they had to sow seeds of doubt among the other merchants and settlers, the ones Hemlock dealt with every day. They would create a tide of public opinion, a wave of discontent that the timid scribe would not be able to ignore. They started with Samuel, the blacksmith, a burly man with a reputation for honesty. Evelyn approached him not with accusations but with a simple question. She showed him a copy of a deed from the papers they had taken, one belonging to a neighbor who had been recently forced out. "Does this signature look right to you?" she asked. Samuel squinted at the paper, then at another legitimate document he had on his own anvil. He grunted. "The notary's seal is smudged," he noted, "and Hemlock's signature is usually more deliberate. This looks rushed, sloppy." It was a small crack in the facade, but it was a start. Samuel promised to speak with the baker next door. The whispers were beginning to build. Over the next 2 days, Evelyn and Kai worked subtly, moving through the town like ghosts. Kai used his knowledge of the back ways and alleys to approach people who were less likely to be seen talking to a Diné man. He spoke to the stable hands and the delivery drivers, people who saw and heard everything. Evelyn focused on the shopkeepers, presenting them with small inconsistencies from Barlow's records. A land survey that did not match the town map, a water rights clause that was clearly fraudulent. She did not ask for their support directly, she simply planted the seeds of truth and let them grow in the fertile ground of their own suspicions. The mood in Santa Fe began to shift from one of resigned fear to one of simmering anger. Arthur Hemlock felt the change. His customers were asking questions. They were looking at their deeds with new, suspicious eyes. They spoke in low voices when he approached. The blacksmith had stared at him for a full minute that morning with an expression of profound disappointment. Hemlock's carefully ordered world was beginning to crumble. He was a man caught between a shark and a rising tide. One evening, as he was closing his office, he found a single, unmarked envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a page from Barlow's own ledger, showing a list of payments made to the sheriff. There was no note, no threat. Just the cold, hard proof of the corruption he had been complicit in. That night, Hemlock did not sleep. He paced the floor of his small room above the office, the ledger page lying on his desk like a condemnation. He thought of his wife, who had died believing he was an honest man. He thought of the town he had once been proud to serve. The fear of Barlow was a physical weight, but the shame of his own cowardice was becoming unbearable. At dawn, he made a decision. He unlocked a hidden drawer in his desk and pulled out the original town ledgers, the ones Barlow thought had been destroyed in a fire years ago. He had saved them, a foolish act of defiance he never thought he would act upon. He would no longer be a pawn, he would be a witness. The following day, a crowd began to gather in the main square of Santa Fe. It started with the blacksmith and the baker, then a dozen farmers who had come into town for supplies. Word had spread like wildfire. Something was happening. Barlow stood on the steps of his office, a confident smirk on his face, flanked by the sheriff. He assumed it was another small protest he could easily quash. He saw Evelyn standing in the crowd, and his smirk widened. "It seems Mrs. Harper is still causing trouble," he announced, his voice booming across the square. "A hysterical woman who cannot accept a generous business offer." Some of his paid associates in the crowd laughed, but most people remained silent, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. "Your offers are not generous, they are criminal." Evelyn's voice rang out, clear and strong. She held up the forged deed. "This is not a legal document, it is a theft," Barlow scoffed. "And who will verify that? Your word against mine?" He gestured grandly to the town. "I have built this place." Just then, a path opened in the crowd. Arthur Hemlock walked forward, his hands trembling, but his expression resolute. He was carrying a heavy, leather-bound ledger. "I will verify it," Hemlock said, his voice shaking but audible to everyone. "I have the original records, The ones you told me to burn, Mr. Barlow." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The sheriff took a step forward but hesitated as dozens of eyes turned on him. Barlow's face contorted with rage. His confident facade crumbled, revealing the desperate bully beneath. "He is lying!" Barlow roared. "This savage has put him up to it." He pointed a shaking finger at Kai, who stood calmly beside Evelyn, his presence a silent pillar of strength. But the accusation backfired. The settlers had seen Kai's quiet dignity. They had heard the truth in Evelyn's voice. And now they saw the undeniable proof in Hemlock's hands. The scribe opened the ledger and began to read, his voice growing stronger with each entry, detailing the original land claims, the ones that Barlow had systematically and illegally altered, cheating them all out of their homes and futures. One by one, the settlers stepped forward, their voices joining a chorus of accusation. "He took my father's ranch. He diverted our water. He threatened my family." The tide of fear had turned into a flood of righteous anger. Barlow, panicked, looked to the sheriff for help. But the lawman, seeing the direction the wind was blowing, slowly backed away, removing his hands from his sidearm. Krieg and his two men, who had been lingering at the edge of the crowd, saw that the game was up. They slipped away, melting into the alleys before anyone could stop them. Barlow was alone, surrounded by the people he had wronged. The price of truth was being paid, not by the brave, but by the corrupt. The sheriff, finally spurred to action by the undeniable will of the people, cleared his throat and stepped forward. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metal clicking loudly in the sudden silence. "Barlow," he said, his voice attempting a firmness it did not possess, "you are under arrest for fraud and extortion." Barlow stared in disbelief, his face pale with shock and fury. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The crowd watched, holding its collective breath as the cuffs were fastened around his wrists. A ragged cheer went up, starting as a single voice and quickly swelling into a roar of relief and triumph. For the first time in years, the people of Santa Fe felt like the town belonged to them again. In the aftermath, a sense of unity settled over the community. The settlers, once divided by suspicion and fear, now worked together. They formed a council to review all of Barlow's land deals. With Arthur Hemlock acting as the chief administrator, his integrity restored. Evelyn found herself at the center of it all, a reluctant leader whose quiet courage had inspired a town. People would stop her in the street to thank her, their gratitude genuine and heartfelt. She saw the blacksmith helping a neighboring farmer mend a broken plow, and the baker giving bread to a family that Barlow had nearly bankrupted. The darkness that had loomed over the valley was finally beginning to recede, replaced by the warm light of community. Kai, however, remained at the edges. He had done what he set out to do, and he was not one for crowds or accolades. He watched from a distance as Evelyn and Louise were embraced by their neighbors. He saw the genuine smile on Evelyn's face, a smile he had not seen before, and felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. His work was done. He prepared to leave, to return to the solitude of the canyons and the quiet ways of his people. As he turned to go, a small hand tugged on his sleeve. It was Louise. She looked up at him with wide, serious eyes and held out her most prized possession, a small, brightly colored blue ribbon from her hair. "For good luck," she said softly. Kai knelt down to her level. He accepted the ribbon, his large, calloused fingers gentle as he took it from her. He met her gaze and saw not fear, but trust. "I will keep it safe," he promised. Just then, Evelyn approached, her own smile faltering when she saw that he was preparing to leave. "You are not going, are you?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "My path lies elsewhere," he said, though his eyes told a different story. "But your home," she countered, gesturing not to the town, but to the small plot of land where her wagon stood. "It needs rebuilding. The barn is gone. We could use your help." It was not just a request for help. It was an invitation, a plea. Kai stayed. He did not speak of paths or destinies anymore. Instead, he spoke of the best wood for framing a barn and the right time to plant corn. He worked alongside Evelyn, their hands often brushing as they passed tools or lifted timbers. The settlers, seeing his tireless effort, came to help. The blacksmith brought iron fittings, the baker brought fresh loaves of bread, and other families brought lumber and their own strong backs. The barn rose from the ashes, stronger and better than before, a symbol of their collective resilience. Louise followed Kai everywhere, her childish chatter a constant happy sound. She learned the Diné words for sun and sky, and he learned the English words for the song she sang. One afternoon, as they were finishing the roof, a rider approached from town. It was the deputy sheriff. He brought news that Krieg had been captured near the river crossing, trying to flee with a saddlebag full of Barlow's money. His testimony, given in exchange for a lighter sentence, had sealed Barlow's fate. The railroad company, eager to distance itself from the scandal, had nullified all of Barlow's fraudulent contracts and appointed a new, more reputable agent. The land was safe. The threat was truly over. Evelyn felt a final, heavy weight lift from her shoulders. She looked at Kai, who was watching her, and a silent, profound understanding passed between them. They had won. As the weeks turned into a month, the rhythms of their lives intertwined. They fell into a comfortable routine, working the land during the day and sitting by the fire at night. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but filled with a deep, unspoken affection. Evelyn found herself watching the way the firelight played on his strong features, the way he would patiently explain the constellations to Louise. He was no longer a mysterious stranger, but a part of her world, a part of her home. One evening, he gave her a gift, a small, intricately carved wooden comb for her hair. "To replace the one you lost," he said simply, though they both knew it was much more than that. She took the comb, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Kai, She struggled to find the words to express the gratitude and affection that filled her heart. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear she had not realized was falling. "You do not need to say it," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I know." In that moment, under the vast, star-dusted sky of the prairie, they both knew that their long, perilous journey was over. They had not just found safety or justice. They had found something far more precious. They had found each other. They had found home. A few weeks later, when the new barn was complete and the first green shoots of corn were pushing through the soil, Kai led Evelyn and Louise on a journey. He took them away from the familiar trail, deep into the canyons he called home. They walked for hours, until they reached a hidden place where a clear, cold river flowed through a series of smooth, stone basins. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. It was a sacred place, he explained, a place of his people. "The water here remembers," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. "It remembers all who have trusted it with their sorrows." The place felt ancient and peaceful, untouched by the greed and violence of the outside world. He invited Evelyn to leave her past troubles by the water. She thought for a moment, then took out the original land deed, the piece of paper that had caused so much pain and fear. It was just a document now, its power gone. She placed it on a flat stone at the river's edge, a symbolic offering to the flowing water. As she let it go, she felt a release, a deep sense of peace settling over her. Kai then surprised her by pulling the intricately carved comb from his own belt. "I want to leave this here," he said, placing it next to her deed. "It was my mother's. I carried it to remember my past. But I no longer need to look back. I have found where I belong." He looked at Evelyn, his dark eyes full of an emotion that made her heart ache with happiness. "My home is with you." Louise, seeing their solemn moment, ran to the water's edge and added her own offering, a smooth, white stone she had been carrying in her pocket. The three of them stood together, watching the river flow, a silent testament to their new beginning. As they turned to leave, the first drops of a summer rain began to fall, pattering on the leaves and stones, washing away the last of the dust and ash from their long ordeal. The scent of rain on dry earth filled the air, the smell of life and renewal. It was a blessing. That evening, back at their small homestead, they sat on the porch of their wagon, watching the rain gently fall. A fire crackled warmly nearby, and the sound of coyotes calling in the distance no longer felt threatening, but like a familiar lullaby. Louise was asleep, curled up between them, her blue ribbon still tied to Kai's belt. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. feeling a sense of contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. The path to Santa Fe had been harder than she could ever have imagined, filled with loss and terror. But it had also led her here, to this man, to this moment of perfect peace. It had led her not to a destination, but to a beginning. A beginning born of trust, courage, and a love that had bloomed in the heart of the wild frontier.